The child had not spoken to Lady Averstone. This was the fact that occupied Julian Hale, Duke of Thornley, as his carriage rolled through the gates of Hartwell Park and turned toward the gray sweep of the house. Lady Averstone had been invited specifically to meet Emmeline. She was the daughter of a marquess, a woman of considerable grace and known gentleness with children, and she had sat in the morning room for the better part of an hour, while Emmeline stood at the window with her hands folded behind her back and said nothing at all. Lady Averstone had tried. She had brought a painted wooden horse. She had asked about lessons in gardens and whether Emmeline liked to draw. The child had looked at each offering the way one might look at a coin whose currency one did not recognize, with interest, briefly, before setting it aside. Julian had watched from behind his newspaper and felt the particular weight of a father who knows his child is not being difficult. She was being precise. Emmeline did not perform warmth she did not feel, and no amount of painted horses would purchase what she had not decided to give. He had married Leonora when he was 24, and she 20. They had been well matched in the way that mattered to families, in fortune, in temperament, in the alignment of estates that made solicitors nod with satisfaction. That they had also loved one another was a private miracle neither of them had expected. Leonora had been a woman of sharp humor and steady nerve, the kind of woman who could sit beside a colicky infant for 6 hours without once losing her composure, and who could reduce a presumptuous dinner guest to silence with a single observation about the weather. She had died when Emmeline was 3, a fever that arrived on a Tuesday and took her by Saturday. The physician had stood in the corridor and spoken about inflammation of the lungs, and Julian had listened with the careful attention of a man who would spend the rest of his life wishing he had been in the room instead of the corridor. 2 years had passed. 2 years of nurses, governesses, well-meaning aunts, and the particular silence of a house where someone important is missing. Julian fulfilled every duty. He sat with Emmeline at breakfast. He read to her before bed when he was not dining out. He ensured her rooms were warm and her clothing correct and her governess competent. He did everything a father should do except the one thing a father must do, which was to be present not merely in body, but in whatever deeper way children require and recognize immediately as either genuine or false. He knew this. He knew it the way one knows a wound is infected, by the heat around the edges, by the way it resisted healing. He loved Emmeline. He simply could not find the passage from where his love sat, locked behind his grief, to where she stood waiting for it. It was Mrs. Firth who first mentioned the new maid. Not mentioned, precisely. Mrs. Firth was too careful for that. She had said, in the way housekeepers say things they wish to be noted, that the new girl was settling in well, and that Miss Emmeline seemed to have taken an interest. The new girl was Ruth Ansley. She had come to Thornley Hall through the ordinary channels, a letter of character from a parsonage in Derbyshire, an interview with Mrs. Firth in the housekeeper's parlor, a trial fortnight that had extended without discussion into permanent employment. She was not pretty in the way that caused concern in great houses. She was plain-featured, brown-haired, with a kind of face that suggested she had spent more time outdoors than fashion permitted. She was 22. She cleaned grates, polished silver, and carried linens. She had no appointment to the nursery, no special qualification with children, no reason whatsoever to be the person Emmeline Hale chose. But chose her she had. Julian first noticed it on a Thursday. He had come downstairs earlier than usual. A meeting with Poole, his steward, regarding the drainage works on the lower fields had been moved to 7:30, and as he passed the small parlor adjacent to the kitchens, he saw them. Ruth was on her knees beside the coal scuttle, her hands black with dust, and Emmeline was sitting on the stone floor beside her, with her legs crossed beneath her muslin dress, holding a brass button. "It came off the blue coat," Emmeline was saying, "the one with the velvet collar. I found it under my bed." "Did you?" Ruth said. She did not look up from her work. She did not adjust her tone into the bright, elevated register that adults used with children. She spoke to Emmeline the way she might speak to anyone who had brought her a brass button, with mild interest and divided attention. "Mrs. Firth could sew it back," Emmeline said. "She could. Or you could learn to sew it yourself, and then you would not need to wait for Mrs. Firth. I do not know how to sew buttons. No one does until they do." Emmeline considered this with the gravity of a magistrate. Then she set the button down on the hearth and said, "Will you show me?" "When I have finished this grate. I shall wait." And she did. Julian stood in the corridor for several minutes, watching his daughter sit in perfect stillness on a stone floor while a housemaid cleaned a grate, and he understood, not fully, not yet, but in the first dim recognition of something that would sharpen over weeks, that Emmeline had found what she was looking for. He mentioned it to Mrs. Firth that evening, not as a concern, as an observation. The child appears to have attached herself to Annesley. Mrs. Firth, who had been reviewing the week's linen inventory, set her pen down with a care that suggested she had been expecting this conversation. "She has, Your Grace. It began perhaps a fortnight ago. Miss Emmeline follows her about the house when her lessons are finished." "Does Annesley encourage it?" "No, Your Grace. That is rather the point." He understood what Mrs. Firth meant, though it took him 3 more observations before he could have articulated it. Ruth Annesley did not court the child's attention. She did not perform. She did not kneel down and speak in the careful, sweetened voice that every governess and visiting aunt had used with Emmeline since Leonora's death, the voice that said, "I know you have lost your mother, and I am trying very hard to be gentle with you." Ruth spoke to Emmeline the way she spoke to everyone, directly, without ornament, with the assumption that the person she was addressing was capable of understanding ordinary language. This, Julian would later realize, was the thing. Not kindness. Emmeline had been surrounded by kindness for 2 years, had been wrapped in it like cotton wool until she could hardly breathe. What Ruth offered was something rarer and harder to name. She offered Emmeline the dignity of being treated as real. The second observation came on a Sunday. Julian had returned from church. Emmeline had stayed behind with a head cold, attended by her governess, Miss Craddock, and found the nursery empty. Miss Craddock was in the servants' hall having tea, and Emmeline was in the kitchen garden with Ruth, who was beating a rug over the line. The child was not helping. She was sitting on an upturned crate with her hands in her lap, watching the dust billow from the rug in great amber clouds, and she was talking. "And Mrs. Firth says the jam will not set because Cook used the wrong sugar, but Cook says it is the fruit and not the sugar. And I think they are both wrong because the jam from last summer was the same sugar and the same fruit and it set perfectly well." "Perhaps it is the weather," Ruth said, bringing the beater down with a crack that sent a fresh cloud of dust spiraling into the cold air. "The weather cannot affect jam." "It can, in fact. Heat and damp change how sugar behaves." Emmeline absorbed this. "How do you know that?" "My mother made jam. She blamed the weather for everything. She was usually right." "Is your mother alive?" "She is." "Does she still make jam?" "When the weather permits?" A smile. Small, quick, private. The kind of smile Emmeline had not given to Lady Averstone, nor to Miss Craddock, nor, if Julian was honest with himself, to him in some time. It vanished almost immediately, the way a bird lands on a branch and lifts away before you can be certain of its color. But he had seen it. He stood at the garden wall for a long time after that, watching Ruth beat the rug and Emmeline talk about jam, and he felt 2 things at once. Gratitude so sharp it was almost painful, and a shame so deep he could not look at it directly. The third observation was the one that altered everything. It was evening, late enough that the candles in the upper corridor had been lit. Julian had come upstairs to say good night. This was the ritual, always the ritual, the brief visit to the nursery where he would sit on the edge of Emmeline's bed and ask her about her day, and she would answer politely and he would kiss her forehead and leave, and both of them would feel the distance between what the moment was and what it should have been. But the nursery door was ajar, and the room inside was not arranged as he expected. Emmeline was in bed, the coverlet pulled to her chin, and Ruth was sitting in the chair beside her, not reading, not speaking, simply sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance while Emmeline fell asleep. "You do not have to stay," Emmeline murmured. "I know. Miss Craddock always leaves when she thinks I am asleep." "I am not Miss Craddock." A pause, then, very quietly, in the voice of a child who is testing whether something is safe. "Will you be here tomorrow?" "I work here, so yes." "That is not what I mean." Ruth looked at her then. Julian could see her profile from the corridor, the plain, steady, unremarkable face of a woman who understood exactly what the child meant and was not going to cheapen it with false promises or bright reassurances. "I will be here tomorrow," she said, "and I will tell you if that changes. You will not wake up and find me gone without warning. That is not how I do things." Emmeline's hand crept out from beneath the coverlet and found Ruth's sleeve. Not her hand, her sleeve, as though she wanted to hold on but had learned not to hold too tightly. Julian stepped back from the door. He walked to his study and sat in the chair behind his desk and put his hands over his face and stayed there for a quarter of an hour while the candle burned down and the house settled into its nighttime silence. He was not weeping. He was doing something worse. He was recognizing, with the clarity that comes only when one has run out of ways to avoid it, that a housemaid had given his daughter in 3 weeks what he had failed to give her in 2 years. Not love. He loved Emmeline. He had never stopped loving her. But love locked inside grief is no use to a child who needs it now, in this room, on this evening, in the specific and irreplaceable present tense. Ruth had walked into his house and offered Emmeline nothing more than consistent, unperformative, honest presence, and Emmeline had responded to it the way a plant responds to light, immediately, completely, and in a direction she could not have explained. He began to pay attention after that, not to Ruth, to himself, to the way he entered rooms, to the voice he used with Emmeline, to the difference between being present and being in attendance, which he now understood were not the same thing at all. It was slow. He would not pretend otherwise. He sat with Emmeline at breakfast and tried to listen the way Ruth listened, not with the performance of attention, but with the thing itself. Emmeline noticed. Children always notice. She did not comment on it, but her sentences grew longer, and she began telling him things she had saved. The dead sparrow by the garden wall, the crack in the nursery ceiling that looked like a map of Italy, the fact that cook put too much salt in the broth on Thursdays because she was distracted by the butcher's delivery. He laughed. He could not remember the last time he had laughed in this house. Emmeline stared at him as though he had performed a magic trick, and then she laughed too, and the sound of it, bright, startled, ungoverned, went through him like a blade. He spoke to Poole about it in the oblique way that men discuss emotional matters with their stewards. "The household seems to have settled," he said, and Poole, who was a man of 50 and knew precisely what his grace meant, replied that Miss Emmeline did seem much improved of late and that the staff were glad of it. He did not mention Ruth by name. He did not need to. It was Mrs. or Firth who brought the matter to its crisis, as housekeepers so often do. "Your Grace," she said one morning, standing in the doorway of his study with her hands clasped in their usual position of respectful authority. "Lady Ashworth has confirmed she will attend the garden luncheon on Saturday, and she has expressed particular interest in meeting Miss Emmeline." Lady Ashworth was the wife of the Duke of Ashmore and one of the most influential women in the county. Her approval mattered in the way that weather mattered. It affected everything. She had known Leonora. She had written a letter of condolence that was 6 pages long and contained not a single false sentiment, and Julian had kept it in his desk, because it was the only letter that had made him feel Leonora was being remembered as a person rather than a tragedy. "Emmeline will attend," he said. "Yes, Your Grace. Miss Craddock will prepare her." Saturday arrived in the pale gold light of early May. The gardens at Thornley Hall were at their best, the wisteria heavy on the south wall, the gravel paths swept and edged, the long table set beneath the copper beech with white linen and the good silver that Julian's mother had purchased in Bath 40 years ago. 8 guests had been invited. Lady Ashworth arrived first, in a dove-colored pelisse in a bonnet that suggested she took neither fashion nor herself too seriously. Emmeline was brought down by Miss Craddock at noon. She was dressed correctly, a white muslin frock with a blue sash, her dark hair brushed and pinned with a ribbon, her shoes polished, her hands clean. She looked, Julian thought, like a portrait of a child rather than a child. She stood beside Miss Craddock and curtsied to Lady Ashworth and answered 3 questions about her lessons with the mechanical precision of a music box, and then went silent. Lady Ashworth, who was not a fool, glanced at Julian with the expression of a woman who had raised 4 children and could distinguish composure from withdrawal. He felt the familiar weight of helplessness settle across his shoulders. The luncheon proceeded. Emmeline sat in her chair and ate what was placed before her and did not speak unless spoken to. She was not unhappy. She was simply absent, physically present and emotionally elsewhere, performing the motions of a duke's daughter with the competence of someone who had been shown how, but not why. It was during the dessert course, a syllabub that cook had spent 2 days perfecting, that the thing happened. Ruth came through the garden gate. She was carrying a bundle of cut lavender from the kitchen garden. An errand, nothing more. The kind of task that takes a maid past the main house several times a day without anyone remarking on it. She was in her working dress, a plain dark cotton with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a smudge of garden soil on her wrist, and she was heading toward the still-room door when Emmeline saw her. The child's entire body changed. Julian watched it happen. The straightening of the spine, the lift of the chin, the sudden aliveness in the eyes that had been flat and careful all afternoon. It was not dramatic. A stranger would not have noticed. But Julian noticed, because he had spent the last several weeks learning to see his daughter, and what he saw was a child who had just remembered that the world contained someone she trusted. Emmeline stood up. "Emmeline," Miss Craddock said quietly, but the child was already moving. She did not run. She walked with the deliberate pace of someone who knows exactly where she is going and does not intend to be redirected. She crossed the lawn, past the end of the luncheon table where 8 guests sat with syllabub spoons suspended in mid-air, and walked directly to Ruth Ansley, who had stopped on the gravel path with the lavender in her arms and a look of acute professional alarm on her face. "I have been waiting for you," Emmeline said. Ruth looked past the child to the luncheon table, where Lady Ashworth was watching with frank interest, and Miss Craddock had gone the color of paper. She looked at the Duke, whose expression she could not read. "Miss Emmeline," Ruth said carefully, "you have guests." "I know. I have been sitting with them. Now I would like to sit with you." "That is not how luncheons work. I do not care how luncheons work." Julian stood. He was aware that every eye was on him, Lady Ashworth's, the guests, the servants, who had paused at their stations to watch. He was aware that this was a moment in which the correct response, the response expected of a duke and a father, was to call the child back to the table, to apologize to his guests, to have Miss Craddock take Emmeline to the nursery and speak to her about manners and propriety and the importance of behaving well when company was present. He walked across the lawn. Emmeline looked up at him when he reached them. Her hand was already on Ruth's sleeve, the same gesture he had seen in the nursery, the grip that held on but not too tightly, as though she had learned that the things you loved could be taken away without warning. "Papa," she said, not a plea, a statement. She was telling him where she stood. Julian looked at Ruth. She was staring at the lavender in her arms with the expression of someone who wished fervently to be elsewhere and understood that she could not be. "Your Grace," she began. She was not, "I know," he said. He looked at the lavender, at the soil on her wrist, at the plain, honest, unremarkable face of a woman who had done nothing more extraordinary than tell the truth to a child and keep her word about staying. Then he looked at his daughter. "Emmeline," he said, "would you introduce me to your friend?" Emmeline blinked. Whatever she had expected him to say, it was not this. She looked at Ruth, then back at her father, and in her face was something Julian had not seen there before. Not gratitude, not relief, but the raw, stunned recognition of being understood. "This is Ruth," she said. "She knows about jam." Behind them, Julian heard Lady Ashworth laugh, not the polite, contained laugh of a social occasion, a real laugh, warm and startled and delighted, the kind of laugh that signals to every other person present that whatever is happening is not a disaster, but a grace. Julian turned to the table. "Lady Ashworth," he said, "forgive the interruption. My daughter has reminded me that luncheons are improved by honest company." Lady Ashworth raised her glass of syllabub. "My dear Duke," she said, "your daughter has better judgment than most of the House of Lords." The luncheon resumed. Emmeline did not return to her chair beside Miss Craddock. She sat on the bench at the far end of the table, beside Ruth, who had been given a plate she did not touch and a glass of lemonade she held with both hands as though it were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. Emmeline ate her syllabub with renewed interest and told Ruth about the crack in the nursery ceiling, and Ruth said it sounded more like the coast of Portugal than Italy, and Emmeline said she had never seen a map of Portugal, and Ruth said she would find one. That evening, after the guests had gone and the table had been cleared and the garden had returned to its ordinary quiet, Julian asked Mrs. Firth to send Ruth to the study. She came in her afternoon dress, clean, pressed, her hair pinned beneath her cap, her hands folded in front of her in the posture of a servant who expects to be dismissed. Julian saw the set of her jaw and understood that she had already prepared herself for the conversation she believed was coming. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She did not look at him. "What you have done for my daughter." He stopped. He had planned this speech in the way he planned speeches for his peers in the House of Lords, with structure, with argument, with the measured progression of points toward conclusion. But the words he had prepared were wrong. They were formal, where they should have been simple. He started again. She trusts you. She does not trust easily, and she does not trust without reason, and she trusts you. I need you to understand what that means to me. Ruth looked at him then. Her eyes were steady and cautious, and entirely without presumption. I have not done anything, Your Grace. I have only been honest with her. Yes, that's what you have done. He offered her a position, not as a governess. Miss Craddock remained, and the child needed her lessons, but as a companion to Emmeline, with wages adjusted accordingly, and a room moved from the servants' attic to the family corridor. Ruth considered this for several seconds, which Julian would later learn was her way. She did not accept things she had not thought through, even things she wanted. I should like that, she said, but I will not change how I speak to her. I would not ask you to. And I will not lie to her. If I must leave, for any reason, I will tell her myself to her face before I go. Agreed. She stood. She curtsied. She walked to the door and stopped. Your Grace. Yes? She does not need me. She needs you. I am the version of attention she could reach. You are the one she is waiting for. He did not answer. She left, and he sat in his chair for a long time, turning her words over in his mind like a letter he was not yet ready to send. But he heard her, and in the weeks that followed, it was Julian who changed, not in a single transformative moment, but in the accumulation of small, deliberate choices. He cleared his mornings. He sat in the nursery while Emmeline drew. He learned that she preferred her toast with honey and not marmalade, that she was frightened of the portrait of his grandfather in the long gallery, that she could name every flower in the kitchen garden because Ruth had taught her, and that she kept a list in a small notebook of things she wanted to tell him but had not yet found the courage to say. He read the list one evening when she left the notebook on the breakfast table. The first entry, in the careful, uneven hand of a child learning to write, said, I think Papa is sad because of Mama. I do not want him to be sad, but I do not know how to say it. He closed the notebook and placed it exactly where she had left it and went to the garden, where the May light was fading into the soft blue of early evening, and stood among the lavender until he could breathe again. Lady Ashworth called 3 weeks later. She brought no painted horse. She sat in the morning room, and Emmeline came in and spoke to her for 40 minutes about jam, weather, the geography of ceiling cracks, and whether dogs dreamed, and Lady Ashworth left saying she had not had so enjoyable a conversation since the death of her own mother, who had also been a woman of firm opinions and no patience for nonsense. Your girl is remarkable, she told Julian at the door, and your choice of staff is better than your choice of wine, which is saying a great deal. The county talked, as counties do. A duke's daughter preferring a maid was precisely the kind of story that could sharpen into scandal in the wrong telling, but Lady Ashworth's endorsement acted as a seal. If she approved, the matter was settled, and what might have been gossip became instead a story about a widower who had the sense to recognize what his child needed and the courage to honor it publicly. Ruth never sought the attention. She continued to work, not as a maid now, but in the quieter, less defined role of companion, which meant she walked with Emmeline in the mornings and sat with her in the afternoons and told her the truth about everything Emmeline asked, which was a great deal. She did not perform motherhood. She offered something both simpler and more difficult. She offered consistency. It was autumn when Julian understood the rest of it. He had come into the library to retrieve a volume of estate accounts and found Ruth at the window, alone, watching the rain move across the park. She did not hear him enter. Her face in the gray light was unguarded in a way he had never seen. Not sad, not happy, but present, the face of a woman who had spent her life watching the world carefully and had not expected the world to watch her back. He stood in the doorway and knew, not with the thunderclap of youthful passion, but with the slow, certain recognition of a man who had loved once and understood what it cost and what it was worth. He looked at Ruth Ansley, plain Ruth, honest Ruth, Ruth who knew about jam and ceiling cracks and the precise weight of a promise made to a child, and he knew that what he felt was not gratitude, though gratitude was part of it. It was the thing itself, the whole, unmistakable, terrifying thing. He said nothing. He was not a man who said things before he was certain of them. and he was not yet certain whether what he felt could survive the distance between a duke and a parson's daughter from Derbyshire. He took the volume of accounts from the shelf and left, and Ruth turned from the window after he had gone and stood very still for a moment, as though she had heard a sound she could not identify. He courted her slowly, in the manner of a man who understood that trust, once properly built, must not be rushed. He began with small adjustments, changes so slight that only Mrs. Firth noticed, and Mrs. Firth, who noticed everything, said nothing. He rearranged his schedule so that he was in the morning room when Ruth brought Emmeline down from the nursery. He took his coffee in the small parlor rather than the study, because the small parlor was where Emmeline liked to draw, and where Ruth sat mending while the child worked. He did not insert himself into their rhythm. He simply placed himself within its reach and waited. Ruth noticed. She was not a woman who missed things, but she gave no sign of noticing, which Julian would later understand was its own form of permission. She did not retreat, which meant she was willing to be found. He invited her to dine with him and Emmeline, just the three of them, in the small dining room, where the candles made the silver glow, and Emmeline talked without stopping, and Ruth ate everything on her plate for the first time since arriving at Thornley Hall. The conversation was not remarkable. It concerned the weather, the new litter of kittens in the stable, and whether mathematics was useful or merely unavoidable. But something in the ease of it, the absence of performance, the way Ruth laughed at Emmeline's observation that the vicar's sermons were longer when it rained, because he knew his congregation could not escape, made Julian feel, for the first time in 2 years, that the dining room was not a place he had to endure, but a place he wanted to be. He asked her opinion about the new plantings for the south border, and she gave it without hesitation, and she was right. And Poole confirmed it the following day, with the particular expression of a steward who is pleased to agree with someone who is not his employer. He lent her books from the library and found them returned with small, precise notes written on slips of paper tucked between the pages, observations so sharp and unexpected that he began lending books specifically to see what she would write. She had read more widely than her position suggested. Her father, the parson, had kept a library of some 400 volumes, and Ruth had read every one of them by the age of 17, including a treatise on drainage that would later prove relevant to the lower fields in a way that both amused and impressed Poole. He proposed in December, in the library, in the rain-gray light where he had first known. Ruth looked at him for a long time without speaking, and he waited, because waiting was something she had taught him. "I am a maid," she said. "You are the woman my daughter chose, and she was right. The county will talk. The county already talks. Lady Ashworth will ensure they talk correctly." A pause, then, very quietly, "And you? Is this because of Emmeline?" "It began because of Emmeline. It is not about Emmeline any longer. It is about you. It has been about you for some time." She looked at the window, at the rain, at the park she had watched from this room 100 times. Then she looked back at him. Then yes. She did not say it quickly. She said it the way she said everything, with the full weight of having thought it through, of having examined the thing from every angle and found it sound. Julian would learn in the years to come that this was how Ruth made every decision, slowly, completely, and then without revision. She did not second guess. She did not waver. She chose, and then she stood in her choice with the same immovable steadiness she had offered his daughter on a nursery floor. Mrs. Firth, when told, pressed her lips together and nodded once and said, "Very good, Your Grace," and then went to the housekeeper's parlor and sat down and wept into her handkerchief for 5 minutes before composing herself and beginning the preparations for the wedding breakfast with a vigor that alarmed the kitchen staff. Poole shook Julian's hand and said nothing further, which was the highest compliment Poole was capable of giving. They married in January, in the chapel at Thornley Hall, with Lady Ashworth in the front pew, and Emmeline standing beside Ruth at the altar, holding a sprig of dried lavender she had saved from summer. The vicar, who had baptized Emmeline and buried Leonora, and had seen Julian through the worst years of his grief, spoke the words with a steadiness that cost him visible effort. Emmeline held Ruth's hand through the entire ceremony, not her sleeve, her hand. In the years that followed, the house filled in the way that houses do when the people inside them are no longer performing their lives, but living them. A son arrived in the second year. Small, dark-haired, furious at birth, pacific by evening, named Thomas after Ruth's father, the parson. Emmeline, who had asked repeatedly for a brother and received the news of Ruth's pregnancy with the judicial satisfaction of a wish properly granted, appointed herself his principal guardian and informed the nursemaid that Thomas preferred to be held on the left side, a claim that was entirely invented and universally obeyed. Ruth did not become a different person when she became a duchess. She did not learn to perform. She continued to tell the truth, to keep her promises, to speak to everyone, from the cook to the Countess of Lyndhurst, in the same direct, unornamented voice that had first caught a 5-year-old's attention across a kitchen floor. The county, which had expected her to stumble, found instead that she was immovable, not through pride, but through the simple, unassailable fact of being exactly who she appeared to be. Julian kept the sprig of dried lavender in his desk, beside Leonora's letter from Lady Ashworth. He did not think of them as relics of two different lives. They were both evidence of the same thing, that love, when it arrived honestly, did not ask you to forget what came before. It asked only that you remain present for what came next. On the evening of their second anniversary, Emmeline, now 7, tall for her age, still sharp, still watchful, still in possession of the notebook in which she recorded things she wanted to say, came into the library where Julian and Ruth sat reading in adjacent chairs. "I have a question," she said. Julian set down his book. "Ask it." "Did you choose Ruth because I chose her first?" He looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at him. Between them passed the kind of glance that contains an entire conversation. Years of it, the slow accumulation of mornings and evenings and small private jokes, and the particular silence of two people who have learned each other thoroughly. "Yes," he said. "You chose her first, and you were right, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful that you are braver than I am." Emmeline considered this. Then she nodded, once, with the gravity of a child who has confirmed something she already knew, and she climbed into the chair between them and opened her notebook to a fresh page and began to write. Outside, the January dark pressed against the windows, and the candles burned steadily, and the house held its warmth the way well-loved houses do, not against the cold, but for the people inside it. They arrive here like a hand a child reaches for in the dark whenever they are ready.